Hello and welcome back to Marketplace Tech's limited series Decoding Democracy, where we're talking about and misinformation in the 2024 election. I'm your host, Lily Jamali. On this edition of the show, I am joined once again by Marketplace's senior Washington correspondent, Kimberly Adams. Welcome back. It's great to see you again, Kimberly.
Glad to be here, Lily.
So this week, we're traveling through space and time to Arizona circa 2020 to understand how baseless conspiracy theories then about that year's election undermined faith in the election system in the state and also impacted and in some cases even endangered election workers there. And we're doing this because the events of 4 years ago are really shaping how election officials in Arizona are preparing for this year's election. So, Kimberly, with all of that said, remind us what happened in Arizona in the 2020 presidential election.
In 2020, the issues in Arizona started even before the election. It was one of the more tightly contested races. The fact that Fox News was the first to call the race for Biden when just 73% of the votes were in. That was a huge deal. The AP, Associated Press, followed a couple of hours later. But a lot of other networks kind of waited and wanted to see how things turned out, wanted to get more of the results because it was so unusual and so surprising to many people that Biden came out ahead. But in the meantime, a lot of people who were suspicious, and as conspiracy theories started spreading online, people started showing up to protest, especially in Maricopa County, where Phoenix is. People started showing up outside of the place where votes were being counted. And those protests started that night, lasted several days, and we actually have some local news video from that time.
Today, the crowd got bigger, the chanting louder. More of President Trump's ardent supporters, many armed with guns, turned up for rallies outside the building where tens of thousands of ballots are still being counted. These two women drove here from California.
If we don't protect the vote and we don't have legal votes and those votes don't count, we're nothing.
Right. And that as that vote counting continued, Biden's lead started shrinking, which helped people be even more suspicious of that. And on November 12th, 9 days after the elections, other networks started finally calling the state for Biden. But by that point, the vote count had narrowed to just around 10,000 votes. And Arizona flipping blue was such a shock that this was the first time a Democratic president had won the state in 20 years. And it did not exactly engender a lot of confidence among the people who really wanted Trump to win.
Yeah, this is a really important point. And even though Biden was able to flip this state blue, he did so by razor thin margins. It's important to remember that. So every vote really counted in Arizona. Crucial swing state, then crucial swing state in this election. Remind us, what were some of the conspiracy theories from then and how were they spreading?
They were spreading mostly online on social media. There were, of course, some conspiracy theorists like Alex Jones out there actively spreading this messaging. They were saying things that like people who were not citizens, illegal immigrants were voting, or that people were submitting ballots for dead people, or that people who were felons or who were incarcerated and didn't have the right to vote were voting. There were different things like that. But, after investigation after investigation, very, very few election irregularities actually came out, despite hand vote counting and multiple audits. And even any kind of mistakes that there were not enough to swing the election in Arizona.
Yeah. It took almost a year for this to finally be resolved. And it finally was with that election audit that was actually carried out by Trump allies who found no evidence of voter fraud. But clearly misinformation, disinformation, it was rampant. It had very real consequences. So we have been wondering how election officials in Arizona are preparing for this year's election, given that the toolbox for spreading all this stuff is only growing. And with that in mind, I actually got to sit down with Arizona's Secretary of State, Adrian, this past week. He has been hosting these election simulation trainings for officials and other government employees in the state. One recent training actually included an AI-generated deepfake video of Secretary Fontes himself to see if his colleagues could spot the fake. It's been destroyed, so we can't show that video. But I did ask him how his state is planning for all the many ways that AI could be used in this election especially given how quickly this technology is evolving and getting better. Here's one moment from our conversation.
Whenever you talk about AI, it's like the Rumsfeld moment, right? We don't know what we don't know because it hasn't happened yet. All we can do is prepare for what we think is going to be the state of the art at the time that we're going to need to be able to react. So we're really talking about the capacity that AI may have when we get to November, and that's what we're aiming to train towards.
And Kimberly, you hear him talking about the tools that aren't out there, but also some of the tools that are basically brand new. That would include OpenAI revealing this new one that lets you clone a voice with just a 15-second sample of somebody's voice. So there's so much change happening. And another thing the secretary said to me was this idea that AI is simply an amplifier of disinformation, which is a very old weapon that's been a problem for quite a long time in elections and otherwise.
Right. And this idea of the amplification is really key. It's that none of these narratives are new. None of these ideas are new, but the tools being used to spread them and to make them more believable are. And so, yeah, AI has the opportunity to potentially supercharge some of this mis and disinformation, some of these narratives that are being actively perpetuated at some of the highest levels of politics. And I mean, we have to keep in mind that according to CNN polling, like something like 7 out of 10 people in the Republican Party still believe that the 2020 election was illegitimate. And that is a ripe bed of, opportunity for people who are trying to spread lies about the election. And AI is indeed a tool, but it's not the heart of the problem.
Got another stat for you, Kimberly. Half of Americans say they get at least some of their news now from social media. So clearly our information environment is really changing. I asked Secretary Fontes about this shift and what voters really need to know.
Well, what I want voters to know is that they can go to the trusted sources of information in the form of their local election officials, in the form of their secretaries of state. By the way, not all of whom I agree with, but at the end of the day, there is, in what I have seen so far, a bipartisan effort to actually engage almost every voter in the country. And there are some rogue agents here and there that we've seen, some here even in Arizona, that might want to mess with the process. But all in all, across the United States of America, the trusted voices are going to be those folks who actually run the elections. They are your local county clerks or county recorders in some spaces, your secretaries of state. And not all of them deal with elections, but most do. These are the places where you want to get that legit information about the time, place, and manner of your elections. We want to make sure that your vote counts, that you are voting the way that's going to make sure that your opinion and your power is reflected in the results of the election.
I want to get your reaction to that. But first, I want to mention to folks that these clips were part of a much longer conversation that I got to have with Secretary Fontes. And you can hear the full interview in today's episode of Marketplace Tech on marketplacetech.org or wherever you get your podcasts. All right, back to you, Kimberly. What did you think?
I think the messaging is exactly right on point. And I've heard this from lots of election officials all over the country, this idea that your trusted source of information needs to be your local election officials. And even though we would love to believe that our friends and our family and our colleagues on social media are vetting information before they share it, hopefully, or that they know what they're talking about, everybody has the opportunity to fall prey to misinformation. So it's a good idea to sort of line up in advance where you can go to fact check, where you can personally go to get accurate information, because sometimes people do get bad info and share it unwittingly. Sometimes people have bad information and share it on purpose. So pick up the phone, call your local election officials, go to their website and know where to go, just so you can double check it, especially if you hear that like a polling place is closed or that it's been moved or anything like that, is, especially on election day. And we did see this in 2020 in swing states like Arizona and Pennsylvania and Georgia, where conspiracy theories were swirling online. I remember seeing messages often in other languages about this kind of thing. So especially watch out for folks in your community who maybe don't speak English as a first language, who might be even more vulnerable to this kind of misinformation.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned some of these other states because we're all vulnerable wherever we live in the US. And I want to talk a little bit more about that. Arizona, of course, just one place that is being really proactive. We're seeing the state of Michigan, election officials there holding very similar tabletop election simulation trainings like the one that Secretary Fontes is holding in his state there in Arizona. Kimberly, as you've been ramping up your reporting on this upcoming election, what have you been hearing from officials?
Earlier this year, I went to a summit by this group called the Election Assistance Commission. It's a semi-government agency that supports training election officials all over the country. And they were really out meeting together to try to talk about how to build trust in the election. And one of the things that they were discussing with each other was what they were going to do about AI, how to engage in outreach in the community, meeting with pastors, local DJs and sort of radio personalities and community leaders, so that people who are the trusted voices in a community can know that they can refer their own communities back to election officials. And also just trying to raise awareness. You see states and counties all over the country spending a lot of money for public service announcement and advertising campaigns to try to warn people about the misinformation that's likely coming and what they can do to try to, get the right information for themselves and protect their own right to vote in their own election. Because one of the other side effects of this mis and disinformation is if you actually do go and cast your ballot for the person you want to, and then somebody else undermines the election, that puts your own vote at risk.
All right. Well, that is a great note to end on. Kimberly, thank you so much for being back on the show.
Thanks for having me, Lily.
And thanks to all of you in our audience for joining us for Decoding Democracy here on YouTube. New episodes drop bi-weekly on Tuesdays. If you have stories, by the way, that you'd like to share, we would love to hear from you. So leave your stories in the comments below. And if you enjoyed today's episode, of course, please like and subscribe. Rosie Hughes produced this week's episode, and I'm Lily Jamali.